Hi, and welcome to this Azure Back to School session with me, John Kilmister. Before we go much further, let me introduce myself a bit more. I'm a software engineer and software architect, primarily working in Microsoft Azure. You can find me on Twitter at John Kilmister should you have any questions or are interested more in this topic. You can also read more of my work at my blog at blueboxes.co.uk. In this short session today, we're going to talk about Azure Blob storage, and more precisely, focus in on the lifecycle management feature. But why talk about this? Well, by utilizing the different features of Blob storage, and more precisely the lifecycle management features, we can start optimizing our costs and ultimately saving money. We're going to go into quite a lot of detail in this session, but at a high level, what is lifecycle management? Well, it's a set of features that allow us to automate processes with the blobs that we have in our storage account. More precisely, based on a set of rules that run each day, it can do one of two core things. It can either move the blobs that we have stored between different access tiers, hot, cold, and archive, or it can delete them. In this short session, we're going to cover a number of topics to help us better understand how we can use lifecycle management. We're going to start by talking about storage access tiers, what they are and how they work. We'll then look at the first stage of automating our processes by setting a default access tier for any new blob that is added to the storage account. We will then look at how we can manually move the blobs between different access tiers. It's important to understand how this works so we can then later on automate the process with the lifecycle management. And moving blobs between tiers or deleting them early has different cost considerations. And in this section, we'll cover those and the things that we need to think about before making decisions. And then finally, we'll run through some demos on how we can actually use lifecycle events to automate all of the things that we would have covered up until this point. Before we go on to talk about the different storage tiers, I wanted to talk about the different types of storage account. Your tenant may still have some of the standard V1 storage accounts. These are now marked as legacy, and they don't support the different tiers of blobs or the lifecycle management that we're about to go on to talk about. The standard V2 and premium SKUs are what you get if you go and create a storage account today. These do support everything we're going to be talking about, though the premium SKU does have some limitations that you may want to read about. You can upgrade a standard V1 to a standard V2 to get access to these features. It's definitely worth reading the documentation to learn about the considerations that you need to think about and the costs involved. Let's now take a look at blob storage tiers. Each of the blobs in your storage account can be set to one of three tiers: hot, cool, or archive. Each of these tiers have a different set of prices and a different set of features. And if we want to optimize our costs, it's important that we understand how each of these tiers work and also how we're going to be using the blobs in our storage account. The hot tier gives us the lowest access cost of these three tiers. However, it also is the most expensive to store our data. This makes it ideal for when files are in constant use. They're either being read or modified frequently. The cool tier, in comparison, has a slightly lower storage cost than the hot tier. However, each time we access the file, it's going to cost us more money. The cool tier is designed for storing things like backup files that we in short term, disaster recovery, or just general files that aren't requested that often. Finally, we have the archive tier. This has the lowest storage cost of the 3 tiers and is designed for long-term storage. However, if we want to access the files in the archive tier, we first need to rehydrate them by moving them back into either the cool or the hot tier. That can be done either in standard priority, which might take up to 15 hours, or high priority in maybe under an hour. And that's why we consider archive storage to be offline, while cool and hot storage are online. While we're looking at the tiers, there's also something else to consider. And that is the amount of time that it has to be in that tier. So a file that is in cool storage must remain in cool storage for 30 days to take full advantage of that tier. When we put something in archive storage, it must stay there for 180 days in order to take full access of that tier. And we'll be covering a little bit more about that later on. We've just mentioned that we can set our blobs individually to any of the 3 tiers. However, a really good starting point once we've analysed how we want to use the storage account is to set a default access tier. This comes into play when any new blob is added to the account. If we haven't explicitly set an access tier, it will inherit the default. Now we're going to have a look at this in the portal, but as with many of these things, we can actually set this in many different ways. Setting the default storage tier can either be done at the time that we create the storage account, as we'll see in a minute, or later on we can modify the default access tier. If we modify the default access tier, it will then apply to all blobs in that account where the access tier hasn't been explicitly set. For now, let's go back and see how we set it on a storage account. Once we search, so we select to create a standard V2 storage account. And from here we fill out the standard details of the account name, the resource group, and the performance, either standard or premium. It's the next page where we can set the default access tier, either hot or cool. What you will notice is missing from here is archive. It's not possible to set archive as a default access tier. Now we've set up the account, we can see the default tier on the overview page. What we're going to do is we're going to add a blob to the storage account now. So we've got a container called samples, and we'll just upload a standard file. Under the advanced settings, you can actually select the access tier, but for now we're going to leave it as the default, and we can see that's marked as cool inferred. And when you see inferred, that's showing you that is the default tier of the storage account. That's now uploaded. Once again, if we close that, we can see against the properties the cool tier inferred. We can move blobs between access tiers in the portal, the Azure CLI, the REST API, or any of the SDKs. However, in this next section, I'm going to show you how we're going to do it in the portal. It's useful to understand this because when we come to automate later on using the lifecycle management, we can compare that back to how we would have done it manually. To change the access tier in the portal, it's as simple as right-clicking on the individual blob, in this case image.jpg, and selecting Change Tier. Change tier then shows as a drop-down. And you can see here we're going to be changing it from the cool inferred to archive. You might also notice that you can see the access tier last modified time, and that becomes particularly relevant as we'll be charged for an early deletion fee if we move it too early. When we choose to move it out of the archive tier, you get to choose between standard or high priority. And again, that's just a drop down that you can select from here. Let's take a deeper look now at blob storage rehydration. As mentioned before, when a blob is placed in archive storage, it's being held at the cheapest storage costs. However, the compromise is you can't read the data inside that blob. You can read the metadata in a read-only mode, and you can also perform certain actions like listing the blobs, copying it to another tier, or deleting it. In order to access the contents of the blobs, we first need to go through the rehydration process. The rehydration process is a copying it from one tier to another. However, importantly, this doesn't affect the last modified time. When we reschedule a rehydration, we can select either standard priority, which is going to happen in under 15 hours, or high priority rehydration, which can take up to an hour. Once we've selected standard priority, we can go back in and upgrade this to high priority before it's been completed. However, if we are in high priority, we can't downgrade to standard. We can check the current status of the rehydration at any time using the properties on the blob. These can be viewed in the portal, in the REST API, using the as CLI, or using any of the SDKs. As it's going to take some time for the rehydration, it would be great to be notified when that is going to be completed. And we can do this by looking at event grid messages. Once the rehydration is completed, a message is placed on event grid, which you can then subscribe to. This allows us to actually put messages into our applications when our rehydration has been completed, or attach things like logic apps so they can send emails or any other mechanism that you wish. So far, we've looked at the different storage tiers and how we can move blobs between these tiers. But one thing we haven't really talked about are some of the cost considerations when choosing to do so. Throughout this presentation, we've talked about moving blobs between tiers. However, this comes at a cost. As we move a blob down from hot to cool, or from cool to archive, we're going to be charged only for the write operations on the destination tier. Remember, once it does make it to archive, it is the cheapest, but it is read-only. On the way up, so if we move it from archive and rehydrate it to cool, or if we go from cool to hot, we're going to be charged for the read operations on the source tier from where it came. So it's important that we understand these and we check these out before we move between the tiers on a frequent basis. Another thing to be aware of are early deletion penalties. Throughout this presentation, we've talked about the need for blobs to stay in cool storage for at least 30 days and in archived storage for at least 180 days. The reason for this is that although you can move or delete your blob before this time, you are charged for the entire duration. If we look at this example, we have a blob that was moved to cool storage. it was there for 20 days and then deleted, meaning we still had 10 days left before the 30-day limit. You'll be charged for the entire 30 days, even though it actually only stayed in cool storage for 20. This also applies not only if you delete a blob, but if you move it from cool to hot. If we take the example with archive, the same is true here. If we put it in archive storage because we don't feel we need access to it, then 80 days later realize that actually is a file we need to read, we can rehydrate it. However, by rehydrating it back into cool or hot storage, we will still be charged for the remaining 100 days that it should have been in archive. Now, this is just one of the considerations when moving between tiers, but it's something that you might want to think about. So far, we've looked at the different storage account types, the different tiers that we can use, how to move those blobs between the tiers, and importantly, the cost considerations when moving between the tiers. Now it's time to have a look at how we can automate the process using lifecycle events. It's important to automate because your storage account may have thousands of blobs being added to it, and we can't expect to manually go in and modify each one of those in turn. And although you can use the API to do it, lifecycle events make it so much easier to automate the process. To configure lifecycle events, from the overview page, scroll down in the navigation, and under Data Management, you'll see a Lifecycle Management tab. Selecting this will bring you to the screen where we can now add in each of the rules that are needed. We're going to start by adding a rule for deleting a blob. So we select Add Rule and follow through the wizard. First, enter a name, which will allow spaces and different characters. Once the name's entered, we can choose if it's going to apply to all blobs, which in this case we will, and also what type of blobs. And for this, we're just going to try and delete snapshots after 1 year. So we now create the rules. So we're going to say after 365 days, we want to go through and delete the snapshot. This rule will now run once a day. We're going to have a look how we can do rules that are a bit more fine-grained. In this sample, we're going to delete all of our log files that are older than 7 days, but only in a logs folder inside our container. This time, we're going to select Limit Blobs with Filter, which will give us some new options. Once we've entered how many days, 7, and we're going to select again to delete the blob, we can then go to this new third tab, which gives us a filter set. We can put in a blob prefix. So it's only going to affect blobs that are in this, that have this prefix. You can place up to 10 prefixes. When we click Add, the rule will now apply. Like the other rules, it will run once a day. Deleting blobs from your storage account is a really good way to manage your costs with Azure Storage. You don't have to delete the base blob, as we've seen. You can also select to just delete snapshots or versions. And I found this to be particularly useful. Sometimes you don't necessarily need many versions of a blob. You might only need, say, the last 3 versions. And using lifecycle management, we can go and delete any of those older blobs automatically, in turn saving us money on storage costs. As we saw previously, another way of saving money is to move blobs to a different storage tier. In this example, we're going to move all blobs, snapshots and versions to cool storage after 30 days. After entering the title, we're going to not apply any filters, but we are going to select snapshots and versions. So we've got all blob types. Now what we'll see here is that we have to enter our if and then statement individually for the base blobs, for the snapshots, and the versions. In this example, we're going to keep all three the same, but we could have one rule that has different settings for base blobs, snapshots, and versions. As before, once saved, this will run once a day. So far, all of the rules that we've been putting in place in the lifecycle management have been based around the last modified time. While this can be useful for things like log files and various other types, last accessed time may be more relevant, because if your users are reading a lot of blobs and still actively using them, that doesn't necessarily mean that they've recently been modified. To enable rules on last access date, we first must enable access tracking on the account. This has an additional cost, so it's worth investigating this before using this option. Once enabled, when we create the rule, the first page is exactly the same. In this case, we're going to archive all of our blobs after 30 days of being accessed. Now you can see we have a new option of base blobs were last accessed in addition to last modified. We can now place the 30 in there and select move to archive storage. And that's it. The rule is now created and it will again be checked once a day. That brings us to the end of our session. Thank you for taking the time today to listen to me. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. You can find me at John Kilmister.